Wanted to make a video today on dimensionality and sinusoidality. As you know me, I'm a bit of a dimension freak, and the reason I spend a lot of time here is because, well, if you've read me or followed me at all, you know how I look at the world right now, and we're extremely uneducated. So this is all really an attempt to understand how 3D beings, or help 3D beings understand how they move through space and time. The very first way we do that is by educating them. How do we educate them? Well, let's start by teaching them how shapes work. So the whole point, like as I just said in discussing shapes, is so you can get a good grasp of how your actual consciousness, which is where I spend the bulk of my work, actually interacts and behaves with the world around it. In order to actually explain and diagram the equation that I've actually been able to write down when it comes to your experience, it's hard to term, so I'm just going to put it in a different way. As I said, I was also going to bring up sinusoidality. The whole point in talking about that is that we can essentially describe the Schrodinger equation in sinusoidal form. The reason that is significant is because sinusoidal form, in layman's terms, quite literally, is a way of expressing 2D Cartesian coordinates in one line of text. In so many words, it describes how waves interact with 2D objects. The reason that is significant is because this understanding in topology helps us map it to higher and lower dimensions, literally. So when you start thinking of functions and when you start thinking of sinusoidality, you start thinking of the ability to start being able to express what you are doing and seeing and observing into one line of text onto a piece of paper. That is the whole fucking point of education. In order to express who you are in terms of conscious subjective state, what I have really tried to underline in my work is that the bulk of what I've seemed to come across in other people's work as they've attempted to describe who you are, your consciousness, whatever that is, this little bubbly feeling, most people make really gross assumptions, and I mean that literally. For instance, they'll start from the vastness of consciousness, what you can put into it. This container is functionally infinite. That's, like I said, pretty gross. They'll also instantiate divine-like functions. So, for instance, many think that consciousness is a product of the divine, that it's untouchable in that way in terms of knowledge. Also pretty gross. You'll also have pseudo-intellectuals nowadays, for instance, David Chalmers, tote the idea of panpsychism, which is this idea that anything from this cup of coffee to me is conscious, and how it's a relevant idea to consider anything from this cup of coffee to me as interesting and conscious. Once again, another pretty gross. How do I put this all on a decent framing, like a viewpoint for you guys, frame of reference? If one could just take from the current zeitgeist, you know how that's pretty crazy. There seems to be a lot of pointless suffering getting ready to, keep coming our way for whatever reasons. One can just kind of quickly give that a quick stroke of the brush and say, we are here due to a lot of different axes of control. If you read me, you'll learn about that. But when you start thinking about, if you read me again Robert Moore and his interpretation of where this zeitgeist energy is actually manifesting, you'll realize that ultimately, especially Western thought, has spent a little bit too long in the intellectual arena of its own ego, unfortunately, and that's everywhere, from education, politics, science, academia, arts. I mean, just about any given person in any given profession and any given, just anyone is more than or less is more willing to put their ego on the line and encompass that more than that individual person is willing to talk about the truth for truth's sake. And this is a fundamental fault line in what we like to call integrity. And the fact that people are not only at the, like most of us, I would argue at this point in Western Hemisphere land, are getting to the point where we functionally do not have the ability to learn, interpret data correctly in the world around us correctly, pay attention. Um, you know, the I spent a lot of time, especially in my college days, harping on things like No Child Left Behind, the Fair Reporting Act, and these political decisions have had such grotesque impacts on the infrastructure, on our intellectual infrastructure as a nation, that we now no longer have the cognitive ability to understand what has happened. And we're now getting to a point where talking about science, talking about how to do this stuff correctly, is interfering with violence. And it's just like, we're going in a direction that is pre-World War One. And we're saying, for people who don't understand what that means, nation states were dissolved as a product of World War One. And the vibe for you Zoomers out there, before World War One, was that people essentially invited it in. They were bored. Um, and they cheered it on. And what can be said today is that a lot of the global order, a lot of the deep-seated country-like resentments that nations seem to still have against one another, can be directly pointed at World War One. And we're becoming, once again, so stupid that we seem more or less hell-bent on recreating these conditions that led to pretty creative ways of suffering, if I'm just to put it in one line of text. And like I said, we did it for the sake of boredom. Now we're getting ready to commit the same mistake, more or less, for the same interests of pre-World War One, as it appears to me. How does this all come back to consciousness? Well, as I've said about defining what goes into the container of consciousness, part of what you act upon as an agent in this world, in this universe, is your values. In real time, those values are being affected. Much like Schrodinger's equation, which this is actually where this all lines up sinusoidally, whatever the fuck that word is, but you get what I mean. is that once these two equations functionally collapse on each other, this is what it means to have a conscious subjective experience on any given level. I mean that from your ability to interpret light, sound, noise, feeling, touch, emotion, cognitive states, knowledge. I hope you get my point. Whatever you can put into the container of consciousness, that is exactly what it is. Part of what you can put into the container of consciousness is values, and part of what constructs those values are superpositions. Now, for people who don't understand what that means, that simply is a fancy way of saying you can quite literally make up your values. If you want to say that you want your society, such as a zeitgeist, the notions around politics or what a nation actually is for a lot of people, you can just give them better values and you can say, start working towards that. Instead, what we have is, blatant corruption. We have terrorists leading our nation saying, go that way. And a lot of people are so willing to, instead of talk about the truth, what has happened, what people have fought for, what people are actually fighting for in the face of instantiating their own values. For instance, one of my favorite things to still bring up to this day is notice how no one's really talking about Roe v. Wade or abortion. And my ultimate political point when I talk about that is that it has only ever been used as a divisive tool. Like so much politics since the 70s, since pre-Vietnam. So it's just a matter of like, are we really at the point where we're trying to do the whole Nazi Germany thing again, where we're enslaving / killing off / exiling the more educated, woke enemies of the state and enslaving the rest? It's like, is that really where he's saying this is where we're going? While simultaneously blaming it on what and whoever. This is exactly the Hitler playbook. So I really could care less what people, in terms of a society, have decided to go. I think I stand in line with a lot of people who have more or less suffered enough at the expense of privileged white people, if I'm being pretty and frank about it. At what point, I guess my slam dunk example would be to talk about the indigenous people that we have effectively taken this nation from. And now look what we are effectively deciding to do with it. With our own, for whatever reasons. And their land mass in terms of the land rights that are actually available to those indigenous peoples. I know there are many tribes, and I don't want to bastardize the language. I don't know much, but I do know that they seem to be losing land. And it was theirs to begin with. And not just that, I don't see too much rhetoric around how this nation was built, or the plantations that are still up. It's just like, when are we functionally going to get to the point, not only when we can have someone in charge that's somewhat sane, that somewhat has their interests in line with we the people, but not just that, when are we going to have the functional and cognitive capability to talk about how our nation was founded on slavery, how we essentially made up this tool called the military industrial complex to go pick fights, and how we are essentially killing our own citizens in order to continue to fuel that tool we made up. Want to keep going in that direction? Again, I don't care anymore. I know what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. Y'all can do the spineless lizard look away shit. That's cool. Live your life, guys.